Hello, welcome to Groupthink. My name is Crispin Roberry, and today we'll be talking about Brexit. Is Brexit going to be a success for the United Kingdom? Well, as you probably know, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has finally managed to get a vote passed in the floor of the House of Commons, notably on his reformed Brexit deal. And today we'll be talking about what Brexit means for the United Kingdom, how we arrived at this point, and what it will likely mean for both the UK and Europe for the future. So back in 2016, of course, there was a referendum in which a majority of the British people, 17.4 million of them, voted to leave the European Union. This was a earth-shattering moment in British political life, and it reverberated widely through Europe and the rest of the world. And one thing that I think is grossly under-discussed is why the majority in the UK voted in the first place to leave the European Union. There are three, I would say, constituents in the UK that voted to leave the EU, and they were propelled through some significant events. The first of these groups is the traditional Tory Eurosceptics. These are sort of figureheaded by people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, his sister Annunziata, who's now a member of the Brexit Party. And this group comprises, Eton Knight, right-wing, kind of old British establishment types who just think that the Brits do things better as a rule. They look back on their colonial past, they compare it with the colonies of other European countries and say that Britain just had a more effective way of running an empire. And they think that people in the UK should have confidence in their institutions, their laws, their traditions, to be able to strike it out on their own. And they received a significant boost, I would say, around the time of the Eurozone crisis. So Greece, as you recall, was basically bankrupt. They desperately needed funds. They borrowed significant tens of billions of euros from Germany. And the Tory Eurosceptics were deeply critical of this. They expected Greece to go out of the Eurozone, back to the drachma. Their currency would then depreciate, and it would allow, according to the Tories, the ability to export their way out of this financial crisis, that it would become a very cheap holiday destination for tourists from around Europe and abroad. Greek products and exports would be much cheaper and more attractive. That would create a flood of foreign investment, and ultimately Greece's economy would recover. However, instead of that, the rest of the Eurozone, particularly Germany and France, lent significant sums of money to Greece on the condition that Greece would change some of its domestic, fiscal and social policies to, according to the Germans, become more competitive, and that would reform their economy and bring them out of this crisis. And what created a result was a significant degree of resentment on both sides, that Greece was feeling like it was more of a colony of this Franco-Germanic empire rather than an independent sovereign state within the EU. Meanwhile, the Germans, of course, were very resentful of the fact that they were lending tens of billions of their money to a country that they considered to have bankrupted itself due to its own domestic problems, and that money would be better invested domestically in Germany. The traditional Eurosceptics in the UK at this time were kind of self-exalted, that from their point of view, the reason the UK had not joined the Eurozone and remained with the sterling was largely because of their activism, and that they pointed to Europe and say, look at all the problems of Europe. It's actually, it's a Franco-Germanic empire. It's a sick project. It has gone well beyond its scope, and Britain should have less to do with the EU rather than more. And that resonated with a certain segment of the British electorate. The second group, I would say, is a much larger group, and it's something that has not been acknowledged in Westminster nearly to the degree that it should have been. And that, I would say, this group is the main reason why the 2016 referendum result was such a shock. So this large constituency was condescendingly called the Little Englanders. And the Little Englanders are basically just ordinary people who are disconnected from the bubble of the political establishment, the media, the political lobbyists, the staffers, just trying to get on with their lives. And the consequence of that for the establishment was dramatic. But it's not hard to talk about these people. They're easy to identify. I'll give you an example. Let's say you are a fisherman in Cornwall and you are wanting to expand your business, employ more people, you become more competitive, and you say, I would love to do all those things except the quotas, the boundaries, the permits, the restrictions, the environmental regulations. These are biased against what I'm trying to do and in favour of larger foreign competitors. Well, most of the time you would go to your local MP and say, these are my issues. The MP would then say, I absolutely agree, and I'm going to lobby on your behalf in Parliament. Only now, if you're a so-called Little Englander, all too often, you go to your MP and make your case. The MP says, I absolutely agree. However, this is decided not in Westminster, but in a foreign parliament in Brussels over which I have no control. And so the condescending attitude towards a large number of British people has been simply as a result of the disconnection between that individual and the policies and governance that rules over their lives, over which they have a very tenuous connection in terms of being able to vote in such a way that would remove these policies or change the direction of their country. The third group is a majority of people who are mainly concerned about immigration, the associated perceived crime and change of their cultural life. And for too long, legitimate complaints about this issue has been labelled as nativist, xenophobic, racist, backward, when the simmering resentments that were created from this have been bubbling away into the mainstream and in a completely unspoken way. And I would say there are two main events that precipitated this change in attitude. The first is the expansion of the EU to include, first of all, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia in 2004, and then especially Bulgaria and Romania in 2007. Now, what happened due to the Shenzhen migration arrangements? We had a massive migration from these eastern countries into Western Europe and, of course, Britain, and this puts downward pressure on local wages, particularly for low-skilled, casual, seasonal work, competing with local people. And this creates huge problems on both sides because obviously in the countries where they go from, there is a significant emigration, particularly of young people, people who are aspiring, highly intelligent, often well-educated, moving west and kind of creating a brain drain in their own countries, and then lowering the wages for unskilled labour in the West. And so, basically, this complaint was sort of labelled as xenophobic and racist in Britain, which of course is totally unfair. And so these people did not have a mainstream voice in British life and had to, unless they wanted to be associated with the least palatable forms of political extremism on the ultra-right ring of the spectrum, which the vast majority of the British people would reject, they were left silent. So the second main event was the so-called Arab Spring, where significant uprisings spread across North Africa and the Middle East, resulting in a large migration of refugees and migrants. Now, this was already a problem prior to that, particularly from Tunisia. It was very easy for them to reach an island called Lampedusa off the coast of Italy, and then from there, off into the EU. However, once the Syria civil war began, this turned into a massive wave, invited largely by a speech made by Angela Merkel in 2014, sort of throwing open the gates to the desperate refugees coming from that region. Now, the actual numbers of people that moved was huge, often from places that were not necessarily Syria or Afghanistan, but even if they were, the demographics, you very seldom had sort of women and children travelling on their own. It was largely young men, and this created a significant degree of anxiety in the West. And then married to that, some terrible events like in Nice and in Paris, the bombings in Manchester, and this resulted in just, tremendous backlash against the Muslim communities. And the inability or unwillingness of the political establishment to take the issue seriously, to talk about it, to discuss how the issues of integration should be managed, rather than just proudly espousing the benefits of diversity and change and all of the rest of it, but actually grapple with some of the underlying issues, again, created further resentment. So, and this is a problem, I think, more broadly across the world. But in the UK, given the opportunity to have that referendum in 2016, it was an opportunity to voice that concern. So in June of 2016, the shockwave happened. The people of the UK voted to leave the European Union, the majority, and a large majority of the House of Commons, despite significant reactionary sentiment that had already bubbled against this result, voted to activate Article 50, that would begin the countdown and withdrawal from the European Union, and the Withdrawal Act, which said that come what may, the UK would leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019. And so Theresa May, of course, went and negotiated a deal with the EU. That deal was soundly rejected on 3 occasions in the House of Commons, largely surrounding the so-called Irish backstop, which could potentially bind Ireland into the customs union if a deal hadn't been made with the EU in the transition period. And this, of course, was unacceptable to those who feared the integrity of the United Kingdom in separating from the EU. In particular, the DUP, Democratic Union Party, which is the kind of pro-union political party in Northern Ireland, upon which Theresa May relied on to maintain confidence in the House of Commons after her rather foolish attempt to rush to an election when the vote had occurred, where she managed to lose her majority and was limping along until she was ignominiously booted out many months later. And so Boris Johnson is now, of course, the Prime Minister. He insisted that they would leave the EU on the 31st of October and that would happen deal or no deal. Well, to the astonishment of everyone, Boris Johnson did actually secure a deal to leave the EU from his interlocutors in Brussels. The deal changes the arrangements in 2 critical respects, in my view. The first is the backstop is removed. There are some transition arrangements with Northern Ireland. They will remain in perpetuity until the Northern Ireland Assembly either votes to continue them after 4 years or abolish them. But that's a decision for the first time for the people of Northern Ireland rather than the EU, which is a big change. The second, and I think is even potentially more important, is the regulatory alignment provisions in the withdrawal agreement. So previously it was in the agreement itself, became a legal requirement, and that requirement is that the UK aligns with the rest of the EU on environmental issues, workplace regulations, that sort of thing, which could really make it anti-competitive relative to its own trade deals that it might want to make with the rest of the world. i.e. the EU was fearing that Britain might actually do a better job at negotiating these trade deals and didn't want the UK to have an unfair advantage. It's a little bit ironic in one respect because a lot of these regulations were founded in the UK and then exported to the rest of Europe. But nevertheless, the EU, I think the most punitive provision in the withdrawal agreement were these regulatory alignment provisions that really hamstrung the UK from achieving its potential or the positive aspects of actually withdrawing from the EU. That has now been amended. It's still included in the political declaration that this is sort of an aspiration, that they do want to align where possible and reasonable, but it is no longer a legal requirement for the UK to do so. So what are my predictions? Well, I think there is considerable concern in the EU that the UK might actually succeed. This is one of the understated elements of Brexit. There is a certain degree of anxiety that the UK establishment, the UK institutions, British colonies around the world, the former British colonies around the world are doing much better than perhaps the former colonies of other countries, that the UK actually does have a lot going for it and can actually find its own way. One of the arguments against this is the changing balance of power across the world. Tony Blair in particular believes that with the rise of China, the coming struggle between the United States and China, that the rise of other powers, Brazil, means that the EU has to become more integrated as a way of maintaining the prosperity of its respective countries in this new era of great power competition. And, that's, I would say, where you take a snippet that's true. Everything about the changing balance of power of the Asia-Pacific, the diminishing influence of other powers such as the UK in world affairs, all of that is a reality. Whether or not the best antidote to that is a huge superstructure that's bureaucratic with multiple layers, with multiple languages, multiple interests, that kind of hamstrings the ability of a middle power, or future middle power like the UK, from acting independently. Well, that's another matter. I think that the British people have made a decision that gives them enormous flexibility and opportunity for the future, and provided the agreement is implemented, in accordance, rather faithfully, once the constituent legislation is passed, then I have every confidence that the UK will succeed in the 21st century.